Okay, welcome to today's podcast. We have the most special guests on today. I mean, truly the most special guests in the whole world because they are my parents. And there is no one better to speak about this idea of legacy than them. We're talking about leaving legacies that last. We're talking about legacies that are intentional because legacies aren't built just by default. Legacies are built with intention. And truly, there is no one better to speak to this than Rick and Diane Thomas. Rick and Diane Thomas they are giants in their own right. So I could list off their accomplishments, what they've done in their lives, and it would be a long list. My dad is a CEO, and my mom has been a CEO of her home, of a student life department, at a university near us, of multiple boards. So they're very well qualified, very, very involved in the community in their church. And we'll hear more about that today. But I don't think there's any greater qualification that we could talk about than this letter written by one of their grandchildren, who happens to be my daughter. So I'm going to go ahead and take the liberty to read this on the podcast because it's my daughter. So I can cross those barriers. And I think what this letter points to is this is legacy. This is why we are having them on today, because this is what makes them qualified.
Mm-hmm.
It's the people whose lives that they touch, and especially those closest to them. So I'm just going to read a little part of this. I am McKenna Diane Gilbert, product of a legacy even within my name. Founded by two Shadle Park High School graduates turned grandparents. Two teenagers turned teachers of generosity, of love, of family. I'm proud to be a part of this legacy. Made of 9 little pairs of feet shoved in dusty tennis shoes at 7 a.m., candy store bound, trusty money clip following closely behind. This legacy made of abandoned racer chasers and promises of hot chocolate in the lodge, of patience and foresight. This legacy made of soccer games all blurred together this legacy made of soccer games all blurred together in spectator memory, maybe because none of us were ever really that good, or maybe because the focus instead was on being able to even see the field through the downpour or the occasional snowstorm. The point being that in every memory, there are always 2 grandparents shouting your name from the sideline, even still. So this is why we're having them on today, because I don't know of any 2 people who embody legacy better. So welcome Rick and Diane Thomas, mom and dad, to the podcast.
Thank you. Welcome.
And share our legacy and history.
Yeah. You know what struck me about that letter when I was reading it earlier is that it was a combination of big things and little things. That these big values that you held at, for example, being present at grandkids' soccer games, that was a big value of presence. But the promise of hot chocolate in the lodge, I'm guessing that's a skiing reference because you're a skiing family, that it was those little promises that added up to a consistent presence in McKenna's life. And that is part of what legacy is. It's kind of the big ideas and then the building blocks that build those big ideas. So I'd love to start just talking about the big ideas. When you were starting your family and thinking about the big things, can you name 3 big areas, just the main things that you wanted to focus on as you were building your family?
Well, for me, my upbringing, I think, had an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Both my mother and my grandmother were strong Christian women. My grandmother especially had a great influence on me in terms of, I think I was more like her. She was feisty. She was strong. She had an incredible presence at 18, where she would take her horse and buggy and teach piano lessons and voice lessons in her small community south of Spokane. She just was one of those people that I think I related to at an early age. So that's one of my the main thing is other people in my life that impacted me in terms of how to be a good family, how to develop a strong family life, and what are some of the goals that we thought about as we began our life together.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit about my history is that my parents grew up in the Depression,
Mm-hmm.
so it was tough. And my dad grew up in California and my mom in Spokane. And he had to leave school early to get a job, and he was an iron worker. And that took him to the state of Washington, where he met my mother, and that they were married. And then they worked there until World War II, and then Dad went to war, and I was born in 1943. When he got back from the war, we moved to Spokane, and you never know where God is going to lead you, because it led him to this company that eventually he purchased. It went for sale, and so he purchased it, and that started our family business, which is carried on now for 74 and a half years.
Mm.
And my son-in-law runs it now, Eric. But I worked there for 50 years. In our early married life, I traveled a lot, trying to build a business, traveling all of Montana, Washington, Idaho, Oregon. And but it was a building time for Diane and I. But one thing that happened during that time also is my dad bought some property at Priest Lake, Idaho. And my dad, my brother, and I started building a cabin.
Mm-hmm.
And that became a real gathering place for family, our immediate family as it was growing, and then also my brother's family, which our kids became very close to the twins. He had twins. And so it was a really growing place for our families. And that was in northern Idaho. And that's where McKenna, there was a store not very far away. So we'd walk there every day to get our penny candy and ice cream.
With your money clip.
With my money clip.
That he's known for the money clip, for sure.
Yeah.
And even through today, that has become a real gathering place for our family. Now that the next generations are here, the grandkids come back every summer and spend time there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real bonding place for us to gather.
Yeah.
So part of what I'm hearing is that these ideas of strength, I'm hearing strength in both of your stories, that from mom, your grandma, and dad, as you talked about grandpa. I mean, he was 16, right?
Yes.
When he started hopping trains to go find work during the Depression, which is remarkable. So I hear this kind of overarching idea of there's this strength that you gained from your legacy, from the people before you. And then I also heard that you were starting to build life together, and that you intentionally did some things to do that, including Dad, even the way that you just talked about how you and Grandpa and Uncle Jay built the cabin with your own hands. And so you were a part even physically of building this legacy, this place that has become legacy. And not everyone gets to do that. But I think that is such a beautiful picture, because you literally were physically building it while you were metaphorically building it. And so that strikes me. Alex, what struck you in that?
Yeah, that you both talked about the people before you And so we're talking about the legacy that you are leaving in the world, but it's not without context of the legacy that you experienced from others in your own family. That thread that Krista talked about of strength, but also the impact, the generational impact that your parents had on great grandkids that they probably, I don't know, did your parents meet your grandchildren, their great grandchildren?
The grandmother that I was
Uh-huh.
speaking of, she did.
Mm-hmm.
My mother lost my dad when she was 46 years old.
Mm.
They lived in Southern California at the time. My dad had been very involved in Boy Scouting as a profession, and I even lived at a Boy Scout camp for a while.
Wow.
And they immediately came back to Spokane because I had a 14-year-old brother. So Rick and I were instrumental, I feel, in supporting them at that time as well, because that was so difficult
Mm.
to lose a spouse at that age.
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of our story as well at
Yeah,
that
and
time.
that's a generosity of giving upward, if you will, on the family tree. And I think for many of our listeners, we're at a phase of life right now where we're being called to step in to care for our parents in a new and different way. And you did that, Diane, it sounds like at an earlier age than a lot of people do. So I think that's very relatable for a lot of people. And it's such a gift to be able to love people well that have loved you so well throughout your life.
I think it also speaks to that idea that when we talk about legacy, it is what's being passed down, but it's also that continuous back and forth that's happening between the generations. So it's also flowing upward while it's flowing downward. And I love that visual because that's what legacy is you're kind of leaving that mark in one another. That's what's happening is you're marking each other. And I think in an age where, we're being pulled apart as families and we're being pulled apart as generations, as almost that digital world is making the gap so much bigger. And so how do you see, or what encouragement would you give to people who are struggling with that legacy piece between generations because of some of the current culture?
I think it's a choice that as parents that we made early on. I think you make a decision about what do you want this to look like? How do you want to be a model to your families? Because I do think that's an important piece is to think about.
And I think whatever you can do to gather family together, one thing that comes to mind for me is in my youth, I was a ski racer and then a ski coach. And then I had the blessing of teaching all the kids how to ski and raising them on the mountain. And then beyond the kids, I got to teach every grandkid how to ski. And so we gathered as a family, but I think it's just getting involved in your family's lives a little bit and being, present in the grandkids. And I remember, I'll never forget at the lake cabin, Mom, she loved to play cards and she would always gather my children and the twins, my brothers, around her to play cards and teach them how to gamble a little bit.
Don't gambling never hurt anybody.
That's right.
Just be intentional about, being present, visible in their lives.
And I think another thing that we were very intentional about, once our children were a little bit older, we really wanted to find a home that was in the country and yet close enough in where they would have a chance to build relationships between each other. And I think that really did happen. They became each other's playmates because the neighborhood wasn't as close as probably most people experience. It was a place of gathering of friends, not only for us, but for our children. And as many of you probably know, Krista, she had many friends, and that became the location. And it was wonderful because it was a natural habitat. We had a river nearby. Kids could play in the river, float down on inner tubes, riding bikes, playing soccer. And that was a very intentional decision that we made to develop the family life and that strength that comes from that.
And while we lived down there, we tried to become gentlemen farmers. And we raised horses, goats, chickens, rabbits, turkeys, and dogs. And that tried to get the kids involved in that. And so they did learn a little bit about living out in the country and being a farmer.
It's real character building when you're taking the goats to the vet at 1 a.m. with gashed necks because the coyotes attacked them. That's real character building, Alex.
Well, I was going to say, I just learned something new. I didn't know you had horses at any point in your life.
That was difficult because
the horse ate itself to death. So
well, maybe that's why we haven't talked about it.
Good founder that is not busy.
Well, those are sweet, intentional decisions. And I would love for you to talk to people who now are at our phase of life. So our listeners, many of them are 40s and 50s. What would you say to someone who is 50, my age, about decisions and about what you would want someone to have told you when you were 50?
Well, one thing that we haven't brought up yet is the importance of our faith from a very early age, and I inherited that from those two strong women that were in my family, and I think that we raised our children in that way, the importance of it. We did a church plant in 1980. And our children were at an age that I think they were very much impacted by that because we developed community. We sent them to church camp. They observed us having Bible studies in our home. We were involved with retreats and so forth. So I think for us, that was a very important piece as well that we didn't really talk about. But in regard to the question that you just asked, when you're 50, your kids are probably quite a bit on their own way. You've had an impact on their lives as parents. And so you have a chance at this point, I think, to listen to your own heart. And what really is your passion? Where do you feel led to move at this point in your life? And that happened to me. Rick has always been supportive of me personally, and we're very different personalities.
Hallelujah.
And yet he was always willing to hear me out. I decided that just being a mom was great, but I wanted something more. And that was when we had 3 teens still at home. And I went back to school, got a master's degree, and ended up working at Whitworth University, a wonderful private institution in Spokane. And it was such a fulfilling time in my life. And so looking at yourself, what are some ways that I'm feeling called, whether it's to go into volunteer work at, more deeply. At that time, we definitely did that a lot. We did a lot of fundraising. We were on a lot of boards, supported a ministry that our church has in El Salvador for children's scholarship.
For how many years?
Almost 30
Yeah.
now.
With the
Yes.
same town, same church.
Same church.
Right. And I think, life is bigger than just ourselves. What are some ways that we can make an impact besides our family, at age 50?
And we, always encourage the children to make their own decision and find new interests. And one thing that we really encourage them on, like when they were in college, is to study abroad and travel the world and look at different cultures and people and how they. And one of the benefits of that is whenever they studied abroad, whether it be Switzerland or Spain, that we always went and visited them. And when they graduated or left that program. And so we got to travel with them for a few weeks and learn what they learned and see how they've expanded their horizons. And so we would, I guess the children and grandchildren kind of get intermixed right now, because we're encouraging them to do the same thing. And we got some now in Europe studying, and Krista, she's going to go visit one that's studying in Italy right now. So she's going to expand her horizons a little bit. So I would encourage all parents to, no matter what your age is, to follow that dream. And another thing, just steps back a little bit. When the kids were growing up, we made really a purpose of having dinner together every night. We wouldn't just, throw out, you eat this, you eat that. We had to sit down and talk about the day's activities and what happened, and, just kept that communication going. But it was very definite on our part to do that. Because you can get off the track a little bit if you're going your own ways.
Well, and you still do that. I mean, I see the two of you still gathering for dinner. So talk about even what that looks like now for you as maybe some of your daily habits.
In the retirement community?
Well, just in this stage of life, because I still see you being intentional. I mean, Mom, you're still cooking, like when when you're at the lake, and you're still creating, even if it's just you and Dad.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I think it always was a priority, and the connection is so important, and it's so easy to lose. And I think in this day and age, as you were talking about, children are so busy, and our kids were busy, but we would oftentimes not eat until 7:30 because Rick worked at least 10, 11 hours a day. And the kids would snack before dinner.
And would we snack?
Yes, because they were, that was late, but it just became a priority. And so I guess for us, it's a time that we also can connect with one another and talk about whatever we feel like we need to.
Not only dinner, but breakfast. We usually have breakfast together, talk about maybe day's activities and what's going on and planning, and have dinner together. And now we have dinner because we live at the retirement center. We have dinner with other people that we just go downstairs and find somebody that's sitting maybe by themselves and go and gain new friends or reconnect with old friends.
Yeah, that shows a spirit of not being done, but continuing to live. I mean, new relationships at your age, it's an investment. And new relationships at any stage of life are hard work. And yet you are taking time to build new relationships. How do you manage that? You're living with some new people these days in your community with relationships you've had your entire lives, and then also with your family, because you spend so much time investing in your family relationships.
It's been really interesting. There now are, I think, 5 couples from our church that have ended up in the retirement community.
Mhm.
A dear friend of Krista's, and actually our family, we've known the family for many years. They're moving in today, Darcy's parents. And so I went over and gave her lots of hugs yesterday. And it's a situation for her where she really did not want to leave her home. And so being able to support her through this, and for me, that was a little tough too. And so I know the loss that you feel in that. So hearing new stories, meeting new people, we all have suffered. We all have losses that we've experienced in our lives, and losing your family home is a big loss. So how we can deal with that, not only ourselves, but with others, I think is important.
You know, I was listening to Kurt Thompson, who's the MD who has the center, the intersection of neuroscience and faith. And on this podcast the other day, he was talking about how it is actually through relationships that we heal, and that when we carry each other's burdens, it's as if that burden is divided. And so, Mom, what you described, I think, is so beautiful about a community like that, yeah, there's loss even moving in. And we want to maybe talk a little bit more about that today, of how to help, even our parents transition. But I think when you surround yourself with people you can share those painful experiences with, it's interesting because what he talked about, and I'll link to the podcast, but he talked about how it's part of how we can heal is by sharing that pain with one another. So I love what you just described.
And we've been intentional about also not cutting off our old friends, with them, keep connecting. We've traveled with some, we've had dinners with some, and trying to keep those relationships that we've built over the years still viable and important in our lives.
Well, in fact, so my parents just got back from Peru. They're 80. They're 80, and they just went to Machu Picchu. And I think this speaks a little bit to how they live their life. So, I was nervous about you going to Peru, and I was thinking, I was saying my goodbyes and teary because, at that altitude. But I think it speaks to this idea that you keep growing, you keep putting yourselves out there, you keep kind of like Dad, you were talking about opening up your world to other cultures. So even talk about that, and you were traveling with old friends.
Yeah.
So that's what reminded me of that. So, talk about, how did you keep that spirit throughout your whole lives of continuing to grow, continuing to put yourself out there, do things that I don't see other 80-year-olds doing. How did you do that?
That's a great question. I think we had a group of friends that were active, and we were involved not only in our kids' life, but their kids' lives and how they were growing up. And we used to do things like with our friends, like dance club, where there are 50 couples that go out once a month and dance somewhere, at different locations. We also had an Academy Award party where everybody would make a 3-minute film. When you had the old cameras, we'd make a 3-minute and then have a Academy Award, and you'd vote for best actor, best play, best singer, whatever. And we would come and gather with lights and then also we had lots of Christmas parties with families, with kids, and just kept connected with people that way.
We also, both of us love to travel. And so we were fortunate in that Rick's business connections would have these wonderful conventions. So we would get to go to a lot of places. And we didn't have financial resources at that time, but we got to go because the company was supporting that. And then when our children, they started going off to study abroad programs, we would go over and visit them. We also did a Holy Land tour and following the path of St. Paul in Turkey through a professor and a pastor that were friends of friends. And so I think you just get the bug and you just want to see what else is out there in the world. And I think we've imparted that to our children as well and grandchildren. So that's been a real enrichment for us as a couple.
Yeah. And I hear that as you were launching your kids into the world, you started to have more bandwidth to be able to have some of those adventures together because you were either visiting one child one-on-one or just you had the time to be able to do that. And I think that probably feels relatable to a lot of our listeners too, that when your kids leave, and I heard Rick, you talk about this a little bit when you were mentioning of following their passions, that you can join them in that and it can offer a new angle of relationship with your now young adult children. So can you speak to that transition specifically, that as kids left for college and then maybe graduated from college and started to make their own decisions, become a little bit more independent, how did you invest in your relationship with them? And how is that different than when you were parenting them more actively?
Well, we just loosened the reins and just let them, encourage them to experience life and to, look for a partner. They all found great partners in life and just encourage them to grow in faith and find good friends. I'm not sure if I'm on the right track or wrong.
You're doing great.
But it was,
well, and I think
we supported them all we could, whatever we could, through, traveling with them or go ahead there.
Well, I think as the grandchildren, it's different. I think your children versus your grandchildren. And I think as grandparents, you really have, I think, a lot of leeway because, you just want to have fun with them and you just want to have that relationship. You're not the disciplinarian. At least we weren't. We just enjoyed them. And we have 10 grandchildren. And that has been by far the most incredible blessing for us. And we have an extremely close-knit family. And I think a lot of that has to do with that our children at an early age loved and respected one another and had lots of fun together, shared experiences together. And I think they made very wise choices with the spouses that they chose. And they were very, very well suited for one another. And so I think that also helped in creating a family bond. And they all get along. So I just feel like God has blessed our family very, very much in that regard, because I think a lot of families don't have that blessing.
Krista, I have a question for you in that.
Yeah.
Did your parents do something because we can't control if people get along, right? But maybe we can influence the environment so that people get along a little better. Did your parents do anything that you noticed that helped as you transitioned or as you started to have this larger extended family with spouses?
Yeah, I think one of the things that my mom and dad have done so well is they have just always been open arms to the people around them. And that's contagious. And they've always been generous to the people around them. So as people were coming into our family, I feel like the both of you welcomed them and you were generous with them in all ways. I mean, I think about, Eric, my husband, and, he was young. And I think even when you met him, he had long hair at one point. I don't know. But like dad gave him a job and, because he couldn't find a job elsewhere. So dad gave him a job and really like made him feel important in his workplace, made him feel like he was doing something important. And the employees still joke about what he did because he had to time people. Anyway, I think my dad created the position for him. But I think just it points to they were just always welcoming and they were always generous with who they were and anything that was theirs because our spouses or our boyfriends or girlfriends were someone who we loved, they loved, and they brought into the circle because they were important to us. Mm-hmm. And that matters and that makes a difference. And it wasn't as if they never expressed concerns over maybe different people we were dating. It's not that they weren't honest, but they were generous in their approach with people. And I think there's just a mark of a person. Can we just say the mark of love? Can we just say that's ultimately rooted in Christ? Like the mark of love that just seemed to unite the experience with the people that you're around. And that included our spouses. Okay, well, we are going to take a quick break. This is part 1 of the 2-part series on legacy. And so we will be right back so we will be back next week with part 2, and we look forward to having you back then.